started like every other morning in the high-profile courtroom packed with media giants and hushed speculation, but when the bailiff opened the side door and announced, "Next witness, Mr. Will Smith," the air changed like a thunderstorm breaking over a still lake. Every camera light flicked on, every lawyer sat up straighter, and even Diddy's expression faltered for the first time in weeks as the Fresh Prince himself walked in, not with a swagger, but with a soldier's poise and eyes that didn't blink when they met the defendants. Because this wasn't about old beef or Hollywood rumors anymore. This was testimony under oath, and the stakes were measured in federal time, not box office returns. No one expected Will Smith to testify, not even the prosecution, who had filed a sealed subpoena under emergency provisions after a confidential informant leaked tapes linking a 2004 party at Diddy's Miami estate to a chain of coercion allegations involving minors, narcotics, and blackmail schemes masked behind music industry contracts. And Smith, who had been mentioned in the documents only as WS with a redacted statement, had flown in overnight alone without his publicist or legal team, stating only, "It's time," when asked why now after all these years of silence and loyalty and what he once called industry code. As Will took the stand, the courtroom was dead silent. Even the stenographer paused momentarily when the judge asked, "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" And Will said, "Yes, Your Honor," in a voice that didn't tremble but wasn't acting either, because this was real. And the scars he was about to name didn't fade under fame. They festered. He began slowly, methodically, not naming names at first, just telling the story of a 2004 party in Star Island, Miami, where he said the energy was off, where young men were handed drinks with floating crystals and told it was a vitamin shot, where security guards blocked off hallways and cameras were banned, but microphones weren't, because what they were recording wasn't music, it was control. "I was invited there to talk about a deal, a soundtrack project," Will said, eyes locked on the jury. "But when I got there, it was clear the conversation was about business, it was about submission." And at that word, the courtroom murmured, and Diddy's lawyer whispered something rapidly into a legal pad. But Will didn't flinch. Didn't break, just kept going like a dam finally giving way. He detailed how he tried to leave the house that night but found the gates locked, how his assistant was told to wait outside, and how a man he only identified as the handler offered him a drink with a smile too wide and a message too clear: "You're either in or you're in the way." And for the first time, the courtroom heard not just what happened to women behind Diddy's parties, but what happened to men too. Men with brands, with Oscars, with families they were too afraid to lose. Will never used the word assault directly, but he described being shown footage later that week of him, confused, half-clothed, manipulated, and being told by someone on Diddy's team, "Don't worry, this stays between kings." And when he reported it privately to a lawyer, he was told the phrase every survivor hears in the celebrity machine: "It's your word against his, and he owns the media." As Will's voice tightened, he looked at the jury and said, "This isn't about revenge, it's about exposure." And with the prosecutor asked, "Why now?" to which Will responded, "Because I saw the tapes Cassie submitted, and I heard the audio of that hotel room, and I couldn't sit in silence anymore while people called her a liar. I was there, I know what this man is capable of." And with that, the courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in a stunned silence so loud it cracked the mask off every industry illusion. Because if Will Smith was saying this under oath, if the golden boy of Hollywood was turning on one of the biggest moguls in music, then it meant no one was untouchable anymore, not even the man they used to call love. The courtroom doors hadn't even fully shut behind the judge before Diddy's lead attorney, Brian Steele, grabbed his briefcase, turned to his client, and whispered through clenched teeth, "You didn't tell me about that," because no amount of law school or spin control could prepare you for Will Smith walking in with receipts and setting your entire strategy on fire. The legal team scrambled like chess pieces in retreat, their previous air of confidence crumbling with every second the photograph sat on that courtroom screen, haunting the room like a ghost too bold to fade. And by the time they reached the hallway, Diddy's other counsel was already on the phone with someone higher up. Someone panicked, someone furious that Will had been allowed to speak unchecked. Inside the courtroom, the jury was silent, frozen in the kind of shock that makes you forget where you are, what you were doing, because none of them expected this trial to become a referendum on a Hollywood system more corrupt than anyone dared imagine. Will remained seated on the witness stand, hands clasped in front of him like a man who had just opened the vault of a secret he never wanted to own, his breath visible in the tension, his stare steady on the judge's empty bench, waiting for the gavel to return. "We need to move to suppress," Steele barked when the judge returned, but the judge didn't blink, didn't move, just leaned into the microphone and said, "The witness's testimony is protected under federal disclosure. Motion denied." That's when it happened. Diddy stood up without being called, mouth open like he had something to say, something to scream. But all that came out was a single word, raw and broken: lies. Will's head tilted slightly, not surprised, not angry, just tired. "You think I wanted to be here," he said, turning his gaze to Diddy for the first time. You think this is some script? This is my trauma, and I buried it for years. But you? You buried it in plain sight, on yachts, in music videos, behind veils of philanthropy and perfume ads. Diddy lunged forward, shouting something incoherent, something primal, and for a split second the courtroom dissolved into chaos as security surged forward, hands outstretched, tackling the mogul before he could reach the stand. The gallery screamed. The judge slammed the gavel. Reporters scrambled for their phones. One of Diddy's lawyers threw their folder across the table in frustration. And Steele, his face white as snow, stood quietly, calmly, and said 3 words that left the room breathless. "We're withdrawing, Your Honor," gasps again. Will turned his head. "Excuse me?" the judge asked, not sure he heard correctly. "I said we're withdrawing," Steele repeated. "Effective immediately. This is no longer a trial. This is a circus, and we're not clowns." Diddy shouted, "You can't quit!" But it was too late. His entire legal team was already walking out, briefcases in hand, like men trying to escape a house on fire before the roof collapsed. The judge banged the gavel again, calling for recess, but the damage was already done. "Mr. Combs," the judge finally said, "you will remain in custody until new counsel is appointed." Will, still seated, exhaled slowly. "He still thinks this is about winning," he whispered to no one in particular. "It's not. It's about truth." As the courtroom emptied and headlines exploded across every major news site, the question wasn't whether Diddy would survive the trial, it was whether anyone else connected to him would survive what came next. Because if Will Smith had the courage to speak, who else might follow? Who else had a photo, a memory, a secret sealed inside their silence, just waiting for the right moment to rise? And in that moment, in that fragile quiet, the world began to watch not just a trial, but a reckoning. The news broke faster than anyone could spin it, lighting up every major network, every tabloid, every blue check account that had been silent until now, and for the first time since this case began, the world wasn't debating if Diddy was guilty, they were wondering what else he was hiding. Will Smith's testimony had cracked the dam. But what came next was the flood, and it began with a single voice message, one that prosecutors confirmed had been authenticated, time-stamped, and traced directly back to a number registered under Sean Combs' inner circle. The recording, played in open court the next morning, was scratchy but unmistakable. Diddy's voice low and erratic, whispering threats laced with paranoia and power. "You know what happens to people who talk, we make them ghost." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap, and Will didn't flinch. He just nodded like someone who'd waited a long time for others to hear what he already knew. "This isn't just my story," he said, addressing the judge again. "This is what happens when money becomes a weapon and fame becomes a mask." Diddy, now without legal counsel and shackled at the ankles, shook his head and muttered to himself, eyes darting around the courtroom like a man searching for exits that no longer existed. Reporters whispered frantically. Some of the jurors shifted in their seats, and a few, for the first time, looked afraid. The prosecutor then pulled up a timeline, connecting names, places, flights, and non-disclosure agreements. More than 30 of them, each signed by a different person linked to the music mogul's private parties, and each one suspiciously similar in language and payout. Then came the photographs, some blurred, some clear, some too disturbing to show uncensored on live broadcasts, but all damning. And when the prosecutor asked Will if he recognized any of the faces, he hesitated for only a moment before replying, "Yes, and they're not all victims." That line stopped everything. The gallery gasped. Even the court stenographer paused before typing. "What do you mean?" the prosecutor asked. Will exhaled. "Some of them knew. Some helped, some got rich off it." Suddenly, the case wasn't just about Diddy. It was about everyone who stood beside him, partied with him, invested in him, protected him, and now found themselves sweating under fluorescent lights, wondering if their name was next. By noon, subpoenas were flying. By 2 p.m., a former associate had already agreed to cooperate. And by sundown, 3 more witnesses had come forward anonymously, their lawyers requesting protective orders. In the span of 24 hours, the narrative had shifted from salacious celebrity trial to federal investigation with tentacles reaching deep into entertainment, tech, and politics. "This isn't a scandal," one analyst said on live TV. "It's a collapse." And in the courtroom, as the judge reviewed emergency filings, Will Smith sat silently, hands folded, watching the chaos unfold like a man who'd finally uncaged the beast he spent years trying to outrun. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered not just for justice, but for accountability. Signs read, "Protect the truth and no more silence in stardom." Because Will hadn't just testified, he had triggered something seismic, something irreversible. And now, the question hanging over everyone's head wasn't whether Diddy would fall, it was how many would fall with him. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence as Will cleared his throat, his voice low but unwavering as he recounted a night in 2012, a night that had never been mentioned publicly, a night he said changed everything. He had gone to a closed-door industry event hosted by Diddy, one of those infamous mansion gatherings that buzzed with exclusivity and secrecy, where phones were confiscated at the door and NDAs were passed around like champagne. Will testified that the room he was led into was low-lit, almost theatrical, filled with smoke, velvet furniture, and whispers. He wasn't alone. There were other celebrities there. People he trusted, people whose names he refused to speak because he said they're not ready to tell their truth yet. He described being offered a drink that he swore tasted off, a concoction he later learned was laced with a substance he couldn't identify, and then being invited, no, pressured, into a private area by Diddy himself. Will said, "At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding, a bad joke, some twisted Hollywood prank, but then his expression darkened and he said, until I saw the cameras." His words hit like a body blow to the entire courtroom. Will alleged that Diddy ran hidden surveillance operations during these parties, capturing compromising footage to leverage power over his guests. He said it was how he made sure loyalty wasn't a suggestion, it was a requirement. He paused and glanced at the jury. "He told me no one would believe me, that I'd lose everything, my career, my family, that I wasn't untouchable, I was just marketable." Gasps echoed across the benches as murmurs broke through the courtroom tension. Then Will revealed what made him come forward after more than a decade, his son. "My boy found an old email chain, one I'd buried. He asked me why I let someone disrespect me like that." Will's voice cracked. "I realized I couldn't teach him to stand up for himself if I kept sitting in my own silence." At that moment, Diddy's composure cracked. He leaned over and whispered urgently to his legal team, but all eyes were on Will, who wasn't done. He said that years of therapy, denial, and bearing the memory had nearly cost him his identity. "I wore the slap at the Oscars like armor," he admitted, "because it was easier to be hated for a public mistake than pitied for a private humiliation." Reporters were scrambling, jurors frozen in disbelief, and Diddy's face was stone. Then Will pulled out a flash drive. His legal team had it submitted into evidence. "This," he said, "is the voice recording Diddy left on my voicemail the night after. Listen to what power sounds like when it knows no consequences." The judge admitted it as sealed evidence and the courtroom was adjourned for recess, but not before one of Diddy's lawyers stood up, shaking his head, and abruptly walked out. Security flinched. Was it a walkout or a resignation? The whispers began again. The damage was done. Chapter 5 would not be quiet. The tension in the courtroom thickened like fog as the trial resumed, the buzz over Diddy's lawyer storming out still rippling through every row of spectators. But the real tremor came when the prosecution stood and requested the court to play a portion of the audio file Will Smith had introduced the day before. The judge nodded solemnly and the room dimmed as a speaker system crackled to life, filling the courtroom with a voice deep, unmistakable, and dripping with condescension. It was Diddy, allegedly leaving a voicemail just hours after the party Will described. "You had your fun," the voice sneered. "Now you keep quiet, like the rest of them do. I see everything, Will. Don't forget that." The words weren't shouted, but they carried a calm threat more terrifying than any outburst. And when the audio ended, the silence in the courtroom felt like it could swallow oxygen. The judge asked the jury to disregard the emotional reaction they might be experiencing, but how could they, when one of the most beloved stars in America had just exposed what sounded like a coordinated campaign of fear, control, and coercion? Will's legal team immediately submitted a timeline of corroborating events. Hotel receipts, Uber logs, and a sworn affidavit from a former bodyguard who claimed to have escorted Will from the party that night, looking dazed, angry, and silent. But it wasn't just the audio or the testimony that was sending shockwaves through the room. It was the shift in Diddy's posture. Gone was the defiant mogul in designer sweaters, replaced now by a man hunched, tense, visibly rattled, his eyes darting toward the double doors as though half expecting someone else to walk out next. Meanwhile, rumors outside the courthouse were exploding. Social media erupted. Hashtags like Will Speaks and Diddy Trial Truth were trending worldwide. Celebrities who once posed with Diddy at industry galas were now posting cryptic messages or deleting old photos in a quiet frenzy of self-preservation. Back inside, a new witness was called, a forensic audio specialist, who confirmed that not only was the voice in the recording consistent with Diddy's vocal patterns, but that the timestamp aligned with cell tower data, placing Diddy's phone in the vicinity of Will's home that night. The message was real, the specialist confirmed, and it was sent from his number at 2:17 a.m. The jury scribbled notes furiously, some with eyebrows furrowed, some with hands clenched. Then came the twist no one expected. The judge announced that the attorney who had exited the previous day had officially withdrawn from the case, citing ethical conflict of interest, and that Diddy's defense was now in urgent talks to bring in a new legal team. That wasn't just a change of lawyer. It was a signal that someone on the inside may have finally seen the writing on the wall. Will didn't speak that day. He sat, still, composed, eyes fixed forward, not gloating, not angry, just grounded. Like a man who had weathered the storm and was now watching the tide shift. The court adjourned again, but this time it wasn't quiet. Reporters were yelling questions, security doubled at the doors, and whispers of a possible plea deal were already circulating. Chapter 6 was coming, and it wasn't going to wait for permission. The next morning, the courthouse felt different, like a battlefield just before the next cannon blast. Reporters lined the steps, their voices hushed, as if something darker than scandal hung in the air. And inside, the mood was electric, because for the first time in weeks, Diddy wasn't sitting at the defense table. Rumors surged through the hall like a current, some saying he'd fallen ill, others whispering that he was meeting privately with federal investigators. But none prepared the room for what came next. The announcement that Diddy had officially filed a request to delay the trial in light of new information that he claimed required sensitive reassessment of the defense. The judge denied the motion with a tone so sharp it could cut glass, citing that the wheels of justice do not pause for convenience. And with that, Will Smith was called back to the stand, this time to respond to new evidence unearthed in a sealed envelope delivered anonymously to the prosecutor's office the night before. Inside were a series of photos dated from the same night of the infamous party, grainy, time-stamped, but chilling. Will standing stiffly beside a black SUV, flanked by two unidentified men, both of whom matched the description of longtime security personnel rumored to be part of Diddy's private detail. "Were these the men who followed you home?" the prosecutor asked. And Will, his voice steady, replied, "They didn't follow me. They escorted me. I didn't ask them to." That line alone turned the entire courtroom into a powder keg of implications. Escorted, not followed, not watched, escorted as in ordered to. The implication was horrifying. Will hadn't just been a guest at Diddy's party, he had been watched, managed, controlled, and then warned. Then came a bombshell, the second audio clip, also from the anonymous source, this time a recording of what sounded like Diddy in conversation with another voice presumed to be his former lawyer, the one who quit just days before. In the clip, Diddy can be heard saying, "You think Will's going to talk? Man's got too much to lose. He won't, but Will did." And now, the jury heard evidence suggesting that even Diddy's own legal team was aware of a pattern of intimidation, possibly coordinated in advance of the trial. Legal experts seated behind the gallery leaned forward in disbelief, some already whispering about witness tampering charges, others about conspiracy. Will's attorney leaned in and asked, "Does this voice on the tape sound like the same man who threatened you before?" And Will, looking dead into the microphone, answered, "It's the same man who told me I was nothing without his approval." That one sentence was like a wrecking ball through Diddy's empire, not just about the case, but about the grip he allegedly held over careers, reputations, silence. Outside the courtroom, new protests began forming, survivors of industry abuse sharing their stories in solidarity with Will, their signs reading things like "Not just Cassie" and "Silence is broken." The courtroom was ordered into recess due to security concerns after an outburst from a man in the back row who screamed, "He did it to all of them," before being escorted out in cuffs. As Will stepped off the stand, his eyes met the jury's. Some teared up, others nodded with a quiet, solemn resolve. And even though Diddy hadn't shown up, his absence felt like a presence in itself, like the ghost of power losing its grip inch by inch, lie by lie. Chapter 7 would be the unraveling. By the time court reconvened the next morning, the tension wasn't just thick, it was suffocating, like the whole room had inhaled but forgot how to exhale, because everyone knew what was coming. The unraveling, the part where the threads Diddy had pulled for decades finally began snapping one by one. With Will's testimony echoing in the minds of the jury, prosecutors wasted no time dropping the next piece of evidence, an affidavit from a former assistant who'd worked under Diddy for 9 years, a woman known only as V, who had fled the country 6 months prior and had been in hiding until federal agents located her in Portugal under a different name and identity. Her sworn statement alleged not only years of systemic abuse, but a deliberate cover-up of Will Smith's involvement, confirming that the night of the party she had personally overheard Diddy making a call where he said he's too valuable to destroy, so make him forget. That line, so casual, so cold, felt like a confession carved into stone, and as it was read aloud in court, there wasn't a soul in the room who didn't feel a shift. Diddy, who had returned to the courtroom that day under heavy security, sat stone-faced, his usual arrogance replaced with something closer to panic, or maybe disbelief, as though the empire he'd built was dissolving in real time. Then came the live testimony of a new witness, this time a security contractor who had once worked for Bad Boy Entertainment during its peak era, a man named Quincy Miles, tall, silent, the kind of witness that makes juries lean in. Quincy testified that during a 3-month stint working for Diddy's private events, he was ordered on more than one occasion to confiscate guests' phones, erase security footage, and monitor high-profile targets for signs of disobedience. Yes, that was the word used, disobedience, like guests were prisoners and Diddy the warden. When asked who gave those orders, Quincy answered without flinching, Mr. Combs, directly, and when asked if Will Smith had ever been one of those targets, Quincy took a long breath before saying, yes, and I regret not doing more. That moment split the room in half, between those who gasped and those who lowered their heads like they already knew. At that point, the judge issued a warning to the gallery to maintain order, but it was useless. People were crying, whispering, some visibly shaking as the reality set in that what Will testified wasn't just a memory, it was part of a system. Behind the scenes, reports surfaced that Diddy's remaining legal team was in chaos, with junior attorneys allegedly seeking to distance themselves from the case entirely, and one even filing a motion to resign from the bar altogether. The prosecutor's next move was surgical. They requested access to encrypted messages sent between Diddy and several handlers, which could show coordinated efforts to suppress multiple witnesses, not just Will. At that point, the judge recessed early, citing the need to review digital evidence in chambers, but everyone in the room understood the real reason. The court had just been handed the key to a vault that might contain the full blueprint of how Diddy operated in the shadows. Outside, media vans crowded the street, people holding signs reading, "We believe Will," and "The silence ends here," while online hashtags exploded in real time. Diddy trial, Will speaks, Justice Unchained. That night, Will didn't speak to press, didn't post on social media, didn't do anything except stand silently outside the courthouse with his wife by his side. Hand in hand, no cameras, no smiles, just presence. A man who had finally named his pain in front of the world, and the world, for once, listened. The only thing left now was the verdict and the consequences that would follow. And then the courtroom went silent, not just quiet, but the kind of silence that feels like gravity has tripled, pulling every breath, every eye, every heartbeat toward the man standing in the witness box, because Will Smith had just said something no one expected to hear. Not even the judge, not even Diddy himself, whose smirk dropped like a mask falling off a ghost. And that's when the ripple of gasps turned into chaos, the courtroom erupting in a clash of disbelief and raw. Stunned silence. He had paused mid-testimony, hands trembling slightly as he reached into the pocket of his tailored navy blazer and pulled out a small cracked recording device, ancient compared to today's tech, but with a story embedded deep in its plastic frame. And as he handed it to the court clerk, his voice cracked slightly, not with weakness, but with the weight of memory. "This," he said, "is what he said to me when he thought no one else was listening." The judge ordered the recording played immediately, and the courtroom filled with the low hiss of old audio before Diddy's unmistakable voice slithered through the speakers, manic, commanding, whispering threats that tied back to the very things Will had just sworn under oath. Mentions of silence, of favors owed, of things that could make or break a star before sunrise. And suddenly, this wasn't just Will's word against Diddy's anymore. This was evidence, explosive and vile. And Diddy's attorney didn't just flinch. He stood, walked over to his client, whispered something with urgency, and then shockingly withdrew from the case on the spot, handing the judge a folded note and walking out as murmurs spread like wildfire through the crowd. Will stood there, jaw clenched, watching the man who once promised to protect the empire from any scandal now flee from the collapse. And that was when it hit everyone. This wasn't just another celebrity trial. This was an empire unraveling, thread by gilded thread. And the man unraveling it was the same man we all thought lived above it, above them, above this. A woman in the gallery began crying, maybe from vindication, maybe from memory, and one of the jurors leaned forward, gripping the edge of his seat as if trying to physically hold on to the weight of what he was witnessing, because this wasn't about music or fame anymore. It was about power, control, and what it costs when one man believes he can own everyone else's silence. The jury turned slightly, locking eyes with the jury, and said, "You don't have to believe every word, just believe your ears." And that line, it stayed in the room like smoke refusing to clear, like a challenge no one could ignore. And as the session closed, the judge ordered an emergency hearing to reevaluate bail and admit the new evidence. The media outside surged like a tsunami, and Diddy, once the architect of so many narratives, now sat alone, his new counsel scrambling, his old alliances crumbling, and the walls of his legacy closing in. Will didn't linger. He stepped down, nodded to the prosecutor, and walked out with the poise of a man who had waited years to say what needed to be said, not just for himself, but for everyone who had once been too afraid to say it. Because sometimes the loudest eruptions come from the quietest truths finally being heard. And this time, the world was listening. If you want more explosive breakdowns, emotional testimonies, and stories that shake the foundation of fame itself, click on the boxes on your screen right now.